I'm a Whovian.
And I'm a Sherlockian.
And this is Shelf Indulgence.
Hello everyone and welcome to Shelf Indulgence. I'm Vic.
And I'm Katie.
And today we're going to be talking about fandom and what it is and where it came from. It actually originates from the Latin fanaticus, which meant mad in a way, and which went to fanatic and then went to fandom in the early 1900s.
Yeah, actually, the first time fandom is used is in reference to baseball because it came from the baseball slang term fan, and then they combined that with kingdom, and so it was a fandom. And that was actually first used in a 1903 Cincinnati Enquirer article, which is pretty cool because it happened right here. And the actual title for that article was Fandom Puzzled Over Johnsonian Statements. And it was just in reference to some plays that had been made during the game for the Cincinnati Reds. And it's very interesting when we were researching that we were like, oh, in the Cincinnati Enquirer? Are you sure? What a coincidence.
Right here, right next to us.
Exactly. There is also a reference about 25 years later in the Publisher Weekly in 1928. They reference fandom, but it is still in reference to baseball. So fandom as we know it today is a little different from where it originated.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of changed a little, though we could still call the baseball fans a baseball fandom.
Oh, absolutely. Now, I would say, though, that as a fandom as we understand it, the first fandom would be the Sherlock Holmes fandom.
Oh, definitely. Which is not very far off from that time period.
Right. It's, it's one of those first groups where everyone was working together and they were theorizing and being in the meta of what Sherlock Holmes meant. Mm-hmm. And speaking of that, we're kind of going to talk about what the difference between being a fan is and what it means to be a fan in the fandom.
Yes, because you don't have to be a part of the fandom in order to be a fan of something. You can just like something and support it without interacting with the other community members who also do that.
And I think that's the key thing there is that you are contributing in some way to what the fandom is doing outside of the original content. So that means maybe you're making art of the content, maybe you're making alternate universes of the content, maybe you're writing fan fiction of the content. In the Sherlock Holmes fandom, that the original Sherlock Holmes fandom, the theories that they created actually influenced what that art became.
Yes.
And so that's what it means to be in the fandom, is that you are contributing in some way and at some points maybe even influencing the content that is being created.
And making the media itself different.
Exactly, yeah. So with that in mind, there are some astronomical fandoms out there that have changed the course of not just fandom history, but like our outside of fandom history as well. For instance, with the Star Trek fandom, which some people would consider the OG fandom because of how massive that fandom is. The Trekkies are very they have a lot of numbers.
And they were very early and they gathered very early, whereas Sherlock Holmes had people who all read it and enjoyed it together. Star Trek is when they started gathering together to enjoy that.
And in fact, they're the reasons that conventions are so popular today. They're kind of the ones that got the ball rolling on conventions because they were meeting up so many different places and they were cosplaying characters and coming up with new original content outside of what was being written in the books and in the television shows. So you have the Trekkies to thank for Comic-Con is all I'm saying.
They really started that, whereas Sherlock Holmes, they have an origin of influencing the material itself. So even though they were earlier, they didn't start that gathering. They started bothering Arthur Conan Doyle about bringing his character back because they wanted Sherlock Holmes to not have died. So we ended up getting so many more stories about Sherlock Holmes because they just couldn't handle him being gone, and so Arthur Conan Doyle reluctantly had to restart his series and find a way to bring Sherlock Holmes back. And there are iconic Sherlock Holmes stories that wouldn't have happened without the fans going, we want this back right now.
which another modern day example of that would be the Firefly fandom, the Browncoats, if I'm recalling what they're called correctly. But they, Firefly is notorious for being the one series that has one season, and everyone was so surprised, and they're always disappointed to find out that there's not more content. And so the Firefly fandom actually got together and wrote so many letters to the writers and the producers of the show that they got a whole nother movie out of it, that enabled them to have, while it was not the content continually, it was a kind of a wrap up of the content that everyone thought they needed.
Something new, something to give them closure on that universe, which they really didn't have with just the Firefly show itself, because they were so unsatisfied with that ending and that just drop off of content. They were able to get something new, which is amazing.
And you know what? I'm actually surprised that there hasn't been a reboot or because the fans of that were so dedicated to more content.
And they really still are. We do still see resurgences of Firefly fans who are like, well, we want more content. Could you give us something else on top of the movie?
Yeah. And I mean, that's where you get a lot of the original content sometimes is from when there's nothing else to consume from the original content.
And it's not that they're not satisfied with the original, they just want so much more of it because they enjoyed it so much that they have to create their own versions, their own interpretations. They have to create more content for themselves.
Or in the case of Trekkies, they want to create a whole new character within that universe, or they want to explore a character that didn't get as much writing or as much screen time, and so they produce that content based around that specific character.
Exactly.
Which is kind of where you get a lot of the fan fiction and art from that happens in fandoms, is because they want to focus on one particular character. They want to explore an idea that wasn't necessarily explored in the original content,
or that might not necessarily have fit in the original content. There are things that fans are interested in about characters that just don't go in a movie or a book or a TV show because they just don't fit in that media,
which is where you get your alternate universe ideas from. You know, that is kind of a big influence on the outside world as how we gather as a fandom and how we can influence the material. But one of it's oftentimes fans are kind of depicted in a bad light, because we can be so fanatical sometimes. And you know, when you're passionate about something, it's very hard to bring yourself back and kind of look at it from, oh, I'm being a little crazy right now. But it's not a bad thing to be hyper fixated on something that you love, or to be passionate and create content for something that you love. It is also nice to see yourself represented in the content that you are consuming. And two of the things that showed that content of a fan being a part of the show was Supernatural and Homestuck, which both had examples of characters that were fans of the meta.
And that were put into the actual content itself. I know in Supernatural, they went to a whole convention based off of them because they inserted their books into the series. And so they were able to meet representations from the producers of the fans themselves, which was at the time kind of not something that I'd seen anyone do in any show.
Oh yeah, you rarely acknowledge the fans, and you never acknowledge the fans within the show itself.
Exactly.
And Homestuck had a character in it that was shown as writing fan fiction of the other characters in the story, because they too were reading about these characters. So it was kind of a very meta moment.
Exactly.
Where they were reading as the reader was reading. And so it was as if the reader had been put into the story. It was a big step, I think, to kind of take away that stigma that fandoms have sometimes, that there are normal. I don't want to use the term normal, but I mean, we're not fanatical. I guess the word would be. We're just passionate about those projects.
And letting that passion be something that is an interaction with the creators instead of separate from them. The creators are allowed to interact with their fans and have them influence them in a very obvious way rather than the more subtle ways and the more group think kind of ways that were earlier iterations of this, like the writing in everyone at once. There's a conversation going on.
Right. It's not just we've had this one moment in history where we're going to influence. Now it is the creators constantly listening and getting feedback, which can be a good or a bad thing. Yes. But it is an open conversation now, which is far different from what it was obviously when Sherlock and Star Trek were just beginning. The other thing that Homestuck did as a fandom was it launched a whole new media for online comics. Yes. Before that, there were popular comics, but there was never a space where you could say, I like reading online comics. And now that's been created mainly because of the popularity of Homestuck. People realized that was more marketable because people would read and consume that and become fans of such things.
And I remember reading comics online before Homestuck when I was very young, and I had to go search for them. They were not something that like anyone around me knew about. I was just on the internet like going through archives and trying to find things, and they were all very separated. They were their own thing, separate from each other. And now we have these huge websites that bring all the webcomics together, and we have very well-known ones that are spread about and they become memes. And that's an entirely different media landscape from before Homestuck, where they were very individualized and they didn't really make the person money unless they were actually published in a physical form. I know Diary of a Wimpy Kid, oddly enough, started as an online free comic and then ended up getting published, and that's how it made money, which is very different from now. You can just make online webcomics and people will consume them.
Well, and now you have webcomics that were serialized before Homestuck, that were on the internet, that were hard to find, that are now being published as actual books because they're present and people want to read them. And they can now be authors themselves outside of the online realm. I know that, for instance, because her book just came out, Check Please was one that wasn't associated with any of those conglomerate sites. It was just a artist making a comic series that eventually got so popular because of how popular webcomics became that they were able to publish and serialize their comic that they had been putting out online to be purchased and to be put into libraries. And I think that's a big step for online comic artists.
Yes. It's definitely very interesting to see them jumping from kind of an unknown media form that not many people acknowledge to something that was prolific online and into being published in physical content because they are so popular.
Now, I'm sure you guys are wondering, well, this was a lot of fun and we learned a lot of history, but why are we talking about fandoms? Well, this was actually a little teaser for our special episode that is coming out that you guys can watch during LibraryCon. LibraryCon is an event we do here at the library. Usually it's in person, but this year it's all online.
We're going to have some amazing content for you this year.
Yes, we're going to have some live streaming games, some artists, some crafts. It's going to be a lot of fun. And Vic and I have actually planned out a special episode for you guys specifically for LibraryCon. So we just wanted to give you a hint of what to be expected. And this is actually only part 1 of Fandom, so there is more to come.
We'll have a part 2 that will cover a little more in depth some aspects of what fandom is and what it means to be a part of it.
And be a content creator within it.
Exactly.
But we really hope you guys join us for LibraryCon to watch that special episode. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. There's some good treats within it. But for now, I think that's all we have for today. Thank you guys so much for joining us. If you want to look at some of our other videos that we've done, you can check out our website, which is at clermontlibrary.org. Or you can check out our Facebook and YouTube for more content. That's Clermont County Public Library on Facebook and YouTube. So thank you guys so much for watching us today. I'm Katie.
And I'm Vic, and this has been Shelf Indulgence.